Okay, well, firstly to say we're delighted to welcome Kate Hudson, General Secretary of CND. She's one of the highest profile female campaigners in the UK. I think many of us will also know her from the Stop the War coalition. Kate was chair of CND for 7 years, is now General Secretary, and she's also been the head of social and policy studies at South Bank University. Kate is going to talk on an outsider's view: could an independent Scotland transform the world's approach to nuclear weapons? Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me, especially with such an ambitious title to address. Can I just start off by saying how closely CND watches what is taking place in Scotland politically. We have very close relations, obviously, with Scottish CND, we're sister organisations. I think many of us have been up to Faslane on more than one occasion. But the developments that have taken place just in the last few years with the change of government in Scotland have really been an exciting development for us. You know, when the SNP first came to lead the government in Scotland, we were looking at what they were saying about looking at the legal consequences of nuclear weapons and nuclear missiles being transported on Scottish roads and ways in which they could perhaps restrain those developments. We were very excited and pleased by the way in which the government also engaged with civil society organisations and brought Scottish CND and other anti-nuclear campaigning organisations into the room to discuss with them and relate to their expertise. So that's been extremely positive for us. Of course, just in the last few months, since the decision to hold the referendum on Scottish independence, the issue has just taken off exponentially, particularly from our work in the Westminster Parliament. You know, obviously Scottish CND relates up in Scotland, but in the Westminster Parliament we're so aware of the debates which are raging about the possible consequences for Trident and for Britain's nuclear weapons system if Scotland were to become independent. Many of those discussions don't come to the surface because we know that the government has refused to really address the issue because it says it assumes that the Scottish people will be sensible enough not to opt for independence or something like that. But the demand for the Westminster government to really address the issue is mounting, and that really helps to shape our work because it's added a new dimension to the question of nuclear disarmament. In terms of what that might mean for the world if there was to be a Scotland free of nuclear weapons, I think it's potentially very significant. Sometimes we hear people say, particularly advocates of Britain retaining its nuclear weapons, they say no one's going to take any notice, it's not going to make any difference to Iran if we unilaterally get rid of our nuclear weapons. But I don't think it is the case that there would be no impact. On the contrary, I think that there would be a significant impact because it would take place at a time when the global attitudes and orientation towards nuclear weapons and towards disarmament is really changing a lot. I think in the last few years we've seen an enormous shift, not just in Britain, where we know that now that across Britain as a whole, more so in Scotland, but across the whole of the rest of Great Britain, there's a majority against Trident replacement, there's a majority for scrapping Trident. At the same time, globally, there is an enormous drive towards nuclear disarmament, and this is happening in a great number of ways. It's happening at the highest levels of what you might call statesmen. I wouldn't necessarily call all of them statesmen, but people like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, people like that have spoken out in the last few years saying that we should have less reliance on nuclear weapons. They're too dangerous to have. We've got to sort of step down. The US has got to start divesting itself and so on. And those attitudes have been reproduced extensively across the world, in the United States, but also in Europe. Some people in Britain, high levels who have previously been in favour of nukes have now changed their minds. So there's been a sort of shift in attitudes at that level. There's been a shift in attitudes in public opinion level too. But I think one area that's very interesting, which perhaps relates to the fact that we are in a more multipolar world now than we used to be. We used to be a bipolar world, then you had US dominance for a decade, and now other countries are coming to the fore, whether it's China, Brazil, India, the sort of newly developing economic powerhouses. We are in a more multipolar world. And now there's a situation where many countries that didn't previously speak out or feel that they had weight to speak out against nuclear weapons are actually beginning to do that. What we've seen recently is a very interesting development which you may be aware of, which culminated in a conference in Norway last week. Basically, the states that have signed up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the vast majority of them, non-nuclear weapon states, have basically had enough of the fact that there is no movement by the nuclear weapon states towards disarming. Previously, the approach had been, well, we just need to kind of plead with them or remonstrate or tell them it's their legal responsibility to get rid of nuclear weapons. But there's a new approach afoot, which is basically, well, we're going to redefine the discourse, we're going to have a new discussion and a new debate about this, and we are going to start taking steps as non-nuclear weapon states ourselves. So to kind of sort of shift the balance of the debate away from the supposed security concerns of the nuclear weapon states towards the concerns of the non-nuclear weapon states. And what this conference last week in Oslo was about, it was called by the Norwegian government. It was attended by 130 states. It was to look at the humanitarian consequences of the use, either by accident or design, of nuclear weapons. Right? So what would it mean for the populations of the countries of the world if nuclear weapons were to be used? And it was a very significant conference, not only because the Norwegian government involves civil society organisations, UN agencies and so on in it, but because 130 states from across the world came to that conference and decided that they were going to take this initiative themselves. And they had scientists and experts looking at the health consequences of nuclear weapons, which are well known, but also the environmental consequences, the climate consequences of just even a small use of nuclear weapons. There's been a very interesting piece of research recently about what it would do to the climate. If just a couple of nuclear weapons were used, say, on the Indian subcontinent. Apart from the people that would be killed at the time, it would actually have an impact on the climate such that crops would fail in vast parts of the world, leading to mass starvation. So there, as well as the normal results you would expect of a nuclear weapon, you could have 1 billion people dying of starvation. Obviously in countries that would have nothing to do with a dispute that was supposed to be taking place, That conference took place, and those countries, 130 odd countries, decided that they would be meeting again. Mexico is going to host the next conference, and they are taking the first steps towards discussing a nuclear weapons convention which would outlaw nuclear weapons across the world. Whereas previously people had been kind of waiting for the nuclear weapons states to say, okay, we'll give ours up, or we'll go into negotiations for a nuclear weapons convention. Now other countries, what you might call sort of middle powers, not the big powers, they're saying, okay, we're going to start the process ourselves. What was particularly significant from our point of view was that Britain was one of a number of countries that refused to attend this conference, even though it was called by a government, attended by 130 governments. Britain and the other, or most of the other nuclear weapon states refused to participate in that conference, and Britain's excuse was that it would distract the debate from the proper forums, whatever they are, obviously not very effective proper forums. 2 nuclear weapon states did attend, that was India and Pakistan, and they're very keen on this process, moving towards a convention to ban nuclear weapons. But I think that kind of development, where countries that aren't the great powers are beginning to take power and responsibility into their own hands and sort of reshaping both international relations and how they wish to interact in the world. And I must say that when I looked at that, and when I saw that Norway was hosting that conference, we know that Finland has recently been leading the way on trying to get discussions on a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. You can see how countries that perhaps an independent Scotland might identify with in some respects, that could be the kind of impact which a Scotland that was committed to peace and disarming its nuclear weapons could have some kind of significant impact. So I think that that's certainly one area that struck me as very, very relevant. I suppose one of the debates that's been taking place within CND and elsewhere across political debates and so on is, if Scotland did choose to become independent, could it actually get rid of the nuclear weapons? And, well, following again the sort of debates that take place in Westminster, sometimes you wonder whether the Westminster government thinks that it would allow such a terrible thing to happen, that an independent Scotland would be able to get rid of its nuclear weapons. I mean, I suppose I could look at it in 2 ways. First of all, practically, and secondly, politically. Firstly, in practical terms, there is no doubt that if the Scottish government, or an independent Scottish government, wanted to disarm Trident nuclear weapons, they could do so. This document, I've brought a few in case you haven't seen it, which is actually written by John Ainsley from Scottish CND, shows in scientific detail how Trident nuclear weapons could be disarmed and decommissioned within a period of 4 years, from now to being disarmed and decommissioned at Aldermaston. It also shows how within a matter of days, just like a week, they could be taken off patrol and the trigger buttons could be defused. So you could disarm it within a week and have the whole decommissioning process within the matter of 4 years. So in practical terms, it's perfectly feasible. Sometimes people say, oh well, they've been invented now, you can't get rid of them. Well, in actual fact, you can. So that's a complete red herring to suggest otherwise. Politically, could they be got rid of? Well, certainly in terms of public opinion, yes. Obviously, the SNP is committed to getting rid of Trident. We know that at least 70% of the Scottish population, I think, wants to get rid of Trident. It's by far the highest in the United Kingdom. The question really is, I think, from the kind of Westminster point of view, is, well, if Scotland wants to get rid of nukes, where would it go? Where would Trident nuclear weapons go? And I think this is the kind of discussion which the government is really trying to suppress. Because there was another extremely good report which came from John Ainsley at Scottish CND called Trident Nowhere to Go, and he revisited the options which had been considered by the British government at the time of Polaris coming to Britain from the United States, the forerunner to Trident submarines in the late 1960s. And as well as Faz Lane, They also considered well, a place in Northern Ireland, which is not even on the agenda for being considered anymore, but no one's mentioning that. But they also considered Plymouth, that's to say Devonport dockyards down on the south coast of England, Milford Haven in the west of Wales, where you're probably aware there's huge oil refineries and things like that there, and also Falmouth, further along the south coast into Cornwall. So these various places. And at the time, they were all discounted for one reason or another, and Faslane was found at the time to be the best possible option. And John Ainsley revisited these different options and concluded that what had ruled them out at the time still ruled them out. There have been various questions asked in Parliament about this. Most recently, our current CND chair was with one of the shadow Labour defence team, and they also admitted that it would not be possible to put Trident in Devonport. You know, really, there was nowhere for it to go. So we're posed with this issue. If Scotland becomes independent, either Britain has to disarm because there isn't anywhere else for it to go, or what remains of Britain has to ensure that Trident remains at Faslane, come what may. There are some people who suggest that Britain would force, what remains of Britain would force Scotland to retain nuclear submarines at Faslane on the kind of sovereign, so kind of British or English sovereign base, that in exchange for other other share outs in the kind of independence deal, that Trident would be allowed to stay indefinitely, or for 10 or 20 years or so, what would become indefinitely at Faslane. And of course, but there is other opinion. We've had legal opinion published over the last couple of weeks, which suggests that it would be, if Scotland becomes independent, it would be illegal for Trident to remain at Faslane, because under Articles 1 and 2 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a nuclear weapons state is not allowed to put nuclear weapons in a non-nuclear weapons state, and vice versa. Scotland wouldn't legally be allowed as an independent state to host another country's nuclear weapons. So you can see how this debate is going to rage over the next, well, and obviously until the referendum takes place. I mean, I think from our point of view, it's an extraordinary way of really pushing forward the debate on nuclear disarmament. For the British government to be presented with this question almost out of the blue. Maybe there won't be a base for their nuclear weapons submarines, and of course, along with the base for the submarines, there's also the question of the storage of the warheads. There's Faslane base and there's Coolport, of course, where the warheads are stored. And apparently, according to various reports, it's one thing to find a deep water harbour, it's another thing to find a place where you can safely store hundreds of nuclear weapons. So maybe you could maybe host some of the subs at Devonport, but where in Plymouth or near Plymouth, a very large city with a very large population, are you going to store all these hundreds of nuclear weapons? It becomes like a health and safety nightmare waiting to occur, sort of thing. So I think those are all very important issues which must be causing a complete and total nightmare to the British government. There's a couple of issues. Have I got time to just say a couple more things?
As much time as you want.
A couple more issues which I know have been controversial around the question of nuclear weapons and Scottish independence. The first is NATO membership. Obviously, it's up to your party to decide, the policy of whether or not you have NATO membership. I suppose there are some kind of interesting questions NATO is a military alliance which has a nuclear policy, it has a nuclear first use policy, so that might be uncomfortable for a kind of very peace-orientated country to sit within that framework, although we know that Norway, which hosted the Oslo conference, is indeed in NATO. You know, so there are various issues around that, sort of can seem contradictory. I suppose other issues around that are that there are a number of non-nuclear states within NATO. I'm thinking of places like Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium who are actually housing US nuclear weapons under the guise of NATO, and they've tried to get rid of them and they're not allowed to get rid of them. You know, so I think, you know, America always says, well, you know, it has to be a unanimous NATO decision. They're not ours, they're NATO groups, and then other new states have joined NATO. So we want to have nuclear weapons in Europe. Don't get rid of them. You know, so that could also be something which could maybe a constraining factor on Scotland's independent decision making. And then the other issue, which I know is controversial, it's certainly a controversial one for us down here in England, is the question of Trident and jobs. One of the discussions that we have a lot, particularly with some of the trade unions here down in England and with some of the communities, is the question of jobs related to the nuclear weapons system. In particular, we have major discussions with the workforce in the community at Barrow-in-Furness shipyard, where the Trident submarines are made, the Astute-class submarines are made, and so on. We have discussions with them, and obviously there are also other places like Aldermaston where people are employed on nuclear weapons work. You know, so what about the future of those jobs? I think it would be fair to say from CND's point of view that whilst we don't want people to lose their jobs, we think it's more important, and put it like that, that Britain disarms nuclear, you know, in nuclear terms. But at the same time, we're very committed to getting government commitment to invest in other forms of like-for-like industrial employment. I mean, at Barrow, for example, which is a coastal town, we know there are all kinds of options around the development of things like alternative energy provision, marine energy technology, places where you actually create jobs through diversifying away from nuclear weapons production. So that's the discussion we have down in England. I know that it's been a big issue, particularly around Faslane and Coulport. You may well be familiar with this, but I'll just run through just a few figures on this. Currently, there are 6,700 jobs at Faslane and Coulport. That's in total, of which 3,500 are uniformed Navy personnel, 1,700 are contractors, and there are 1,600 civilian employees who don't work on jobs related to Trident. Currently, it's anticipated that when the Astute submarines come to Faslane, which are the kind of nuclear-powered but non-nuclear weapons submarines, they're all going to be located at Faslane if, you know, the government's plans go ahead. If and when they arrive there, that will rise to 8,200 jobs. So obviously that is a significant number of jobs. I know there are discussions, certainly in the locality there, about how many of those would be lost in the event of Trident leaving. In 2008, for example, Des Brown, who was Defence Secretary at that time, he said that there were 589 jobs at the Clyde directly dependent on Trident. So, you know, there are a number of different functions that take place at the Clyde there. 589 are directly dependent on Trident, of which 541 are at Coulport. So in actual fact, the largest loss of jobs would be at the nuclear weapons store, because that directly relates to nuclear weapons. Many of them, of course, are in the MOD police, who could potentially be reassigned elsewhere. But the argument is made, and I know that Scottish CND has done quite a bit of work on this, that most jobs would be retained if conventional submarines were, conventionally armed submarines were maintained at the base. Because it's not sort of all or nothing. If Trident goes, you lose all the jobs at the base and it's closed. If Trident goes, some jobs will go or will be reassigned, and if other conventional submarines remain there. I suppose the question is, in an independent Scotland, what would you want to do with Faslane if you got rid of the nuclear weapons?